Hi there and welcome. A few days ago, in researching something else, I tripped over a few paragraphs of Thirlwall witness testimony for the first time. I'm not following the inquiry. Noticing it was evidence apparently from nurses contemporaneous to Miss Letby at the hospital, I had a read. I have to say, I was never in any doubt that this inquiry would be a tool for reinforcing the official narrative on Miss Letby, but had been content to wait for the final report to see in what way. Within 10 or so lines of reading, I saw evidence that, among other purposes, this sham inquiry was also the vehicle for the stealthy rollout of a particularly desperate and pathetically laughable psyop calculated to future-proof, strengthen and entrench the official narrative on Miss Letby. Over 30 or so lines, I could identify three independent but complementary elements in the testimony which were totally at odds with what anyone would know who'd spent even just a couple of hours researching the case. These three narratives were even at odds with stuff that was in the mainstream media itself, in the tsunami of coverage in the first couple of weeks after the original verdict. As such, these newly minted narratives are naked attempts at creative intervention in the historical process. That was bad enough, but could hardly be called unexpected. What really focused my mind, though, was the fact of the sources of these three bogus narratives being the words of two nurses who were former colleagues of Miss Letby's. It's one thing to go along to get along, by keeping your head down and your thoughts to yourself, but quite another to throw an already broken former colleague under the bus in a public forum. This, to me, argued urgency in throwing some rocks at this rubbish. Without dignifying these two people by naming them, I am going to describe, then deconstruct the two most potentially consequential of these newly minted narratives as I see them. The most significant and nonsensical of the two is the one which seeks to retrospectively profile Miss Letby as more closely in line with the classic serial killer psychological model. I quote, "Her way of speaking to other members of staff sometimes I didn't like and felt wasn't the most professional, but she was very intelligent." Two aspects of this. One, way of speaking. That thing is to evidence an emotional disconnect with normal people and a consequent carelessness of the feelings of others, calculated to engage our idea of the emotionally detached loner aspect of the serial killer kind of model. The reality is that Miss Letby described the nursing team at the Countess as like a little family. She spent her free time with other nurses from the unit, often, as we've seen, appearing in pictures on Facebook. This is a woman who had a best friend from childhood, a best friend who describes her as the most kind, gentle, soft friend. Another friend describes her as joyful and peaceful. Miss Letby kept not one but two rescue cats along with a dog as pets. Prior to the finding of guilt in the original trial, it was universally accepted, even by Cheshire Police and the judge, that Everything about Miss Letby's life evidenced her to be a psychologically healthy and happy person. It is a fact that she had many close friends and an active social life. Her nursing colleagues had previously spoken highly of her care and dedication. Rachel Aviv, the writer of the famous New Yorker article back here from last May, gives information that someone gave her access to a redacted portion of the that means it wasn't in the final report, the official report, a redacted portion of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health's September 2016 report of their review of the spike in deaths at the hospital. In that redacted portion, that secret portion, which wasn't shared with the public, Miss Aviv states that it describes how staff on the unit were, quote, very upset at Miss Letby having been removed from her clinical duties. Just so we're crystal clear, the deaths had all already happened by this time, and the nurses knew exactly why they were being interviewed. How on earth does this square with her now being an antisocial loner who upset people? Come on! Even Jairam himself had to concede that Miss Letby was, I quote, very popular with the other nurses. The loner aspect of the new serial killer narrative is therefore clearly a joke for all to see. The real giveaway on this first narrative, though, is the second aspect, very intelligent. High intelligence is possibly the greatest commonality across serial killers, and certainly the number one trait they share in the mind of the public. Miss Letby's suddenly unearthed high intelligence must be the reason why, despite having had nothing but time on her hands for almost 2 years, she performed so badly in defending herself on the witness stand. Prison is as close to living death as it gets, so she was fighting not just for her career, her good name, and that of her parents, but her very life. Despite those astronomically high stakes, a mercenary professional hitman whose only real stake was the possible pleasure he derives from breaking witnesses psychologically, he gets paid the same whatever the outcome of the trial, was able to beat her into psychological submission within a couple of days and subsequently abuse her at will for the remainder of her 2 weeks on the stand. What was seen on the stand was not the mastery and control high intelligence gives in such circumstances. We saw instead the definitive example of an ordinary intellect miserably failing to get to grips with extraordinary circumstances. Further, the high intelligence that would now have us believe that Miss Letby possesses in order to deny her justice must also be the reason why Miss Letby, despite her medical background and having lived these experiences for years, was only able to express in lame, childlike phrases things about the case which strangers on only a few hours acquaintance with the facts of the case have been able to much more effectively articulate. In trying to pull this one then, they seem to have forgotten that we have seen the despairing expressions on that post-it note, seen the banal text messages, and have forgotten that she went on holiday to Ibiza. The minor chord to the retrospective build-out of the serial killer profile is testimony from the same former colleague, taken to be evidence of Miss Letby having been, quote, excited and gossipy when talking about the death of a baby. What the woman actually says is this: it was almost in a way where she was excited, almost in a gossipy manner. A miss, as they say, is as good as a mile. So while this turncoat former colleague clearly does not actually believe and is not satisfied in her own mind that Miss Letby was excited and gossipy in discussing the death of that baby, she is nevertheless happy to phrase her words to the inquirer in such a way that those words become the primary evidence that Miss Letby was in fact inappropriately excited and gossipy in discussing the death of some poor baby. It is not clear to me if this alleged incident relates to one of the 7 deaths associated with Miss Letby, but the very first point that needs making is that the alleged behaviour is inconsistent with both of the previous sub-narratives of this serial killer kind of like profiling thing. Like, first, if you are an antisocial loner, why would you seek out someone who was evidently not a friend to exchange social strokes with at the end of your shift? Neither is it consistent with the high intelligence trope. Weird behavior draws attention. If it's drawing attention, it's going to threaten your cover. Weird behavior is therefore not smart. Even if we give this talking head the benefit of the doubt as to the veracity of what she says here, so what? At the end of any long shift in such a stressful environment especially, there is a surge of adrenaline or relief or both. Either of them, plus overtiredness, which is a definite after something like a night shift, can be the source of slightly manic behavior. Those states are not dissimilar to drunkenness. So again I say, so what? The hatchet job continued. I quote, I wouldn't say I necessarily had concerns about her. This is mealy-mouthed politician's words, not those of a professional speaking honestly about a former colleague. What's wrong with simply saying, I had no concerns about her? It has to be that, or I could tell she was a wrong one. Not some halfway house encouraging people to speculate maliciously while you retain the refuge of deniability. She further insinuates, I quote, I did think there were parts of her personality that were a little strange to me. Which parts then? Based on what I've just read, there are parts of your personality that are a little strange to me. Anyway, I know I said I would go straight through these 2 newly minted narratives, but before going on to the second, I need to show how, despite this first one being laughable, we still need to take this this retroactive serial killer mapping onto Miss Letby seriously. I say that because there's a program. There's always a program, and the way this program's going to run is that now that they have this narrative, disreputable as it is, on the Thirlwall record, the next thing is they will use their focus groups to work out which demographic within the population will be most susceptible to this nonsense. based on what they find, they will then push this evidence of Miss Letby, of Thirlwall disclosing that Miss Letby was an antisocial loner, highly intelligent, and given to inappropriate reactions around to the deaths of babies. They will push this in a tame newspaper, which obviously one appropriate to that particular demographic, or to an equivalent, or rather push it in an equivalent current affairs TV program or talk show, talk TV type of thing. Once they do that, before you know it, then people who, in the course of being swayed by fact and argument towards, if not recognizing Miss Letby's innocence, at least how unsafe the whole prosecution is, will be suddenly stopping short and pointing out, but she was very intelligent. The papers said so. That they'll be saying as a counter to the overwhelming evidence that this was a frame-up from start to finish. Now, as a supporter of Miss Letby's innocence, pointing to the mountain of evidence that though she was obviously not a half-wit, Miss Letby was certainly not Einstein, will just have them dig their heels in further in such circumstances, meaning that you then have one less person who's going to be willing to put pressure on the government to put this thing right. Essentially, the forces who want to keep everything under the carpet, or rather the forces who want to sweep everything under the carpet, having now got that nonsense on record at Thirlwall, just need to now get the fact of it being on record at Thirlwall out into the media if they haven't already done so. I wouldn't know, I don't read the papers or watch BBC anymore. It is just the old tactic of muddying the waters to preserve a status quo through confusion. Okay, the second of these newly minted narratives I want to talk about is way more subtle, but all the more insidious and pernicious for that. A second former colleague of Miss Letby's makes the seemingly innocuous but ostensibly reasonable point makes a seemingly innocuous but ostensibly reasonable point to the inquiry about safeguarding training. I quote, "It is interesting that while we get training on safeguarding and what to do when we suspect a parent might be harming a child, we don't have anything that tells us what to do if we think it is a staff member, of what behaviour to look out for." This is all very clever. The majority of the public will never have heard of safeguarding training. I've never heard of it. But it's a simple enough concept, and therefore the perfect instrument for generating a kind of a something must be done, moral panic type of public debate. At the center of that debate will be an innocuous, apparently reasonable question, which, however, cannot be addressed or in any way processed mentally without taking for granted something which is not in fact accepted as true. In reality, far from taken as given, and is in fact bitterly contested, that thing being the evidentially and intellectually naked thesis that Miss Letby killed those babies. It is therefore an attempt to smuggle that premise from a state of dubiousness to a state of respectability. the mental, or you could say ideas equivalent of the card sharp or conjurer's sleight of hand. Now you see it, now you don't. Basically, if the pertinent issue is suddenly the ridiculousness of NHS safeguarding training, then it no longer is the disingenuousness rather, which brought the investigation into being in the first place, or the lies and the possibly willful errors by the CPS and the scientific skullduggery and made-up science on which the prosecution was based. In seeding that debate then and setting it rolling to take on a life of its own, what they will have done is to manage to smuggle and embed into the cultural collective consciousness uncritical acceptance of a version of reality, Brearey's, Dryram's and Cheshire Constabularies, to name the main players, in which Baby O, for example, did not die because Stephen Brearey aspirated him in the wrong place, lacerating his liver, but because Miss Letby murdered him. A version of reality which is currently on life support. The more people think and talk about something, whether it's in reality fact or fiction, the more real it becomes in their minds and, by extension, in the collective mind, the collective consciousness. And that ultimately that is always the decisive measure. For example, all the history we learned at school is obviously fully embedded in the collective consciousness, but with the passage of the years and the release of declassified documents, we invariably find that much of that history was in fact fabricated. Just like Miss Letby's crimes were fabricated, and they now seek to fabricate a serial killer persona for her to further dupe the unwary. Okay, so that's what I had to say today. Please feel free to share your thoughts and any information that you think might be of interest to myself or anybody else in the comments below. As usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.